40,000 years ago, Filipinos built boats that could cross 100 kilometers of open ocean. Vikings wouldn't exist for another 39,000 years. And your history teacher never told you about any of this, because the people who wrote your textbooks needed you to believe Europeans invented everything. 40,000 years ago, ancient Filipinos invented technology that shouldn't exist. No metal tools, no written instructions, just plant fibers and pure genius. And this technology allowed them to do something that Europeans wouldn't accomplish for another 39,000 years. I'm talking about ocean-crossing vessels built entirely from rope and wood. And the archaeological evidence is so overwhelming that scientists are literally rebuilding these boats right now in 2025 to prove it actually worked. Spoiler alert, it works better than anyone expected. But here's what blows my mind. Everyone knows about Polynesian navigation. Everyone celebrates Viking longships. But almost nobody knows that Filipinos were building sophisticated ocean-going vessels tens of thousands of years before either of those cultures even existed. Our goal on this video is to get 500 likes and subscribe Time Forge Stories and click on bell and turn on notifications. Join us as we uncover more hidden story. Let me show you why this might be the most impressive maritime achievement in human history. The Philippines is an archipelago of over 7,000 islands. During the last ice age, when sea levels were lower, some of these islands were connected by land bridges, but not all of them. And we know for certain that humans were living on multiple disconnected islands over 40,000 years ago, which means they had to cross open ocean to get there. Not shallow rivers, not calm lakes, open ocean with currents, waves, and 100-kilometer distances between islands. And they did this during the Stone Age. Think about what that actually requires. You need boats strong enough to survive ocean swells. You need navigation skills to find land. You can't see from your starting point. You need confidence that your technology won't fail halfway across. And you need to do all of this without metal tools, without compasses, without any of the technology we associate with seafaring. In 2025, researchers published findings that completely change how we understand ancient maritime technology. They discovered evidence of sophisticated plant-based rope and cordage technology in the Philippines dating back at least 40,000 years. This isn't speculation. These are actual archaeological findings from multiple sites across the archipelago. Now you might be thinking, what's the big deal about rope? Rope is rope, right? Wrong. Rope is everything when it comes to building boats. You can't lash a hull together without it. You can't rig a sail without it. You can't secure cargo or create fishing nets or tie off your vessel when you reach shore. Ancient maritime technology lives or dies based on the quality of your cordage. And Filipinos figured out how to make rope that could handle ocean conditions 40,000 years ago, using only stone tools and plant fibers. Let that sink in for a second. The Vikings, who everyone celebrates as master shipbuilders, had metal tools. They had iron nails and rivets. They had 2,000 years of accumulated Mediterranean and Northern European shipbuilding knowledge to build on. And they showed up around 800 CE. Ancient Filipinos were building ocean-worthy vessels 39,200 years before Vikings existed as a culture. But it gets even more impressive. Recent evidence shows that ancient Filipinos weren't just paddling between nearby islands. They were engaging in deep-sea fishing. 35,000 years ago, They were catching tuna and sharks in open ocean. Do you understand how insane that is? Deep-sea fishing requires boats stable enough to handle ocean swells while you're hauling in fish that can weigh hundreds of pounds. It requires hooks, lines, and nets strong enough to hold these fish. It requires navigational knowledge to find productive fishing grounds and get back to shore safely. And they were doing this 35,000 years ago, while Europeans were painting caves and hunting reindeer. Which is impressive in its own way, but they definitely weren't building boats to catch sharks in the Pacific Ocean. If you're sitting here thinking, why am I just learning this now? Hit subscribe because we're building something different here. This channel exists to uncover the history that got erased from textbooks. Ancient technologies, forgotten civilizations, achievements that colonizers deliberately buried. Over 1,000 of you are already part of this, and every week we're digging deeper into stories that should have been taught in schools but weren't. Drop a comment telling me which ancient culture we should investigate next, because I literally build my research list from your suggestions. The most upvoted comment becomes next month's deep dive. Let me put this in perspective. The oldest evidence of deep-sea fishing in Europe dates to around 4,000 years ago in the Mediterranean. That's 31,000 years after Filipinos were already doing it. 31,000 years is not a small head start. Now here's where the technology gets really interesting. The boats themselves were sophisticated multi-hull vessels with outrigger designs. If you've ever seen a traditional Filipino balangay or bangka, you're looking at technology that has roots going back tens of thousands of years. The outrigger design, which Filipinos and other Austronesian peoples pioneered, is one of the most stable small craft designs ever created. Modern racing sailboats still use multi-hull designs directly inspired by Pacific Island technology. This wasn't primitive. This was advanced engineering that took thousands of years to perfect. These vessels were built using Sewn-Plank construction. Instead of nailing planks together like Vikings did, Filipino boat builders used wooden pegs and plant fiber rope to lash everything together. At first, that sounds like a downgrade. Metal nails are stronger than rope, right? Not necessarily. In tropical environments, wood expands and contracts with temperature and humidity changes. Nailed construction becomes rigid and can crack under stress. Sewn-Plank construction flexes with the wood, making it more durable in tropical conditions. It's not inferior technology, it's optimized technology for a different environment. The Balangay discovered in Butuan, which dates to 320 CE, gives us a window into how sophisticated these vessels became. It was 45 feet long, could carry 30 people plus cargo, and was built entirely without metal fasteners. Every joint was carefully pegged or lashed with fiber cordage, and it was seaworthy enough to trade with kingdoms across Southeast Asia. But that's from 320 CE. The technology we're talking about goes back 40,000 years, which means Filipinos spent tens of thousands of years refining and perfecting these designs. Let me tell you about the Flow project. Right now, in 2025, researchers are reconstructing ancient Filipino watercraft using only the materials and techniques that would have been available thousands of years ago. No modern tools, no synthetic materials, just wood, plant fibers, and stone tools. And you know what they're discovering? These boats work incredibly well. They're stable in rough seas. They're fast and maneuverable. they can carry significant cargo. Early tests show these vessels are capable of long-distance ocean voyages. Modern sailors testing these reconstructions are genuinely shocked at the performance. This isn't theoretical anymore. We're proving through experimental archaeology that ancient Filipinos had maritime technology capable of everything the historical record suggests. Now let's talk about navigation. Because having a good boat is only half the battle. You need to know where you're going. Ancient Filipinos used sophisticated astronomical navigation. They could read wave patterns to detect land beyond the horizon. They understood ocean currents and seasonal wind patterns. They used stars for nighttime navigation and the sun's position during the day. This knowledge was passed down through generations of oral teaching. Polynesian navigation gets a lot of attention, and rightfully so. It's an incredible achievement. But Filipino navigational knowledge was just as advanced and possibly older. Some researchers argue it was even more sophisticated because Filipinos were navigating more complex inter-island routes with unpredictable currents and weather patterns. The Philippines sits in Typhoon Alley. These aren't gentle Pacific swells. These are some of the most challenging ocean conditions on Earth. And ancient Filipinos built boats and developed navigation techniques specifically adapted to survive these conditions. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. When Ferdinand Magellan arrived in the Philippines in 1521, his ships were falling apart. His crew was dying of scurvy. They'd been at sea for months and were barely holding together. The Filipino vessels they encountered were in perfect condition. The crews were healthy and well-provisioned. The boats were seaworthy and well-maintained. Magellan's flagship, the Trinidad, was a cutting-edge European carrack with the latest naval technology of the era. And it was getting outperformed by boats built using techniques that hadn't fundamentally changed in thousands of years. That tells you something about the sophistication of Filipino maritime technology. This wasn't primitive. This was refined, proven, and optimized over millennia of real-world use. Let me address something that's probably bothering you. If ancient Filipinos had such advanced maritime technology, why don't we learn about this in school? Why are Vikings famous worldwide, while Filipino boat builders are barely mentioned outside the Philippines? The answer is colonialism and who got to write the history books. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Philippines in 1521, they found a thriving maritime civilization. Multiple kingdoms were engaged in extensive trade networks spanning from Japan to Java. Filipino ships regularly sailed to China, Siam, Borneo, and the Spice Islands. The Kingdom of Tondo controlled Manila Bay and was a significant regional power. But colonial narratives needed the Philippines to be primitive to justify colonization, so that history got systematically erased. Spanish colonial authorities downplayed or ignored Filipino achievements. And those colonial narratives became the foundation for how Western history books treated the Philippines for the next 400 years. It's only in the last few decades that archaeologists and historians have started seriously correcting the record. And what they're finding is that Filipino maritime culture was far more advanced and far older than anyone realized. Here's another mind-blowing fact. Austronesian peoples, including Filipinos, spread from Southeast Asia to Madagascar on one side and Easter Island on the other. That's nearly half the globe. That expansion represents some of the most impressive ocean voyaging in human history. The distances aren't even comparable to Viking voyages. Vikings made it from Norway to North America, roughly 4,000 kilometers of ocean. Impressive, absolutely, but Austronesian voyagers crossed over 10,000 kilometers of open Pacific Ocean. And they did it with technology that had roots going back tens of thousands of years. Now I want to talk about something that really drives this home. When European explorers started mapping the Pacific in the 1700s and 1800s, they kept finding inhabited islands thousands of kilometers from any mainland. And they couldn't figure out how people got there. European ships with the latest navigation technology, metal hulls, and huge crews were barely managing these voyages. How did ancient peoples with no metal tools somehow make it to these remote islands and establish permanent settlements? The answer is that Pacific Island peoples, including Filipinos, had better boats and better navigation than Europeans gave them credit for. It wasn't luck, it wasn't accident. It was sophisticated maritime technology refined over tens of thousands of years.